On July 7, 1944, the island of Saipan was a smoking ruin. Palm trees were stripped bare by shells. Craters pocked the beaches and hillsides. The U.S. Marines and Army soldiers dug in along a defensive line that stretched across the island. They were exhausted after 3 weeks of brutal fighting. Ahead of them lay the last remnants of the Japanese Imperial Army. The Americans expected small skirmishes, not what came next. At dawn, an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield. Then a sound rose in the distance, faint at first and then deafening. Japanese voices shouted, "Tenno Hika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" From the shadows came a wave of men. There were more than 4,000 of them, a mix of infantry, support troops, and even hospital patients who could barely walk. Many carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Others held spears, swords, or wooden clubs. Wounded men stumbled forward, driven by a single purpose: to die in one final attack. The Americans were stunned by the sight. It was the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. The Japanese poured forward in a human tide, screaming and firing wildly. The U.S. soldiers had seconds to react. Officers shouted orders. Machine gun teams scrambled to their positions. Riflemen braced behind sandbags and rocks. Bar fire teams, small groups built around the Browning automatic rifle, moved to cover the gaps in the line. The bar was a unique weapon. It was heavier than a rifle but lighter than a machine gun. It fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge from a 20-round magazine. A skilled gunner could fire in single shots or short bursts. In the chaos of battle, the bar gave an infantry squad mobile firepower. It could cut down charging enemies while still being carried forward or shifted between positions. This flexibility made it perfect for defending against fast-moving attacks like a Banzai charge. As the first wave of Japanese soldiers hit the American line, the battle exploded into violence. Bar gunners squeezed their triggers. The rifles roared, spitting hot brass onto the ground. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness. The front ranks of the charge collapsed under the fire. Men fell by the dozens, but the wave did not stop. Those behind them stepped over the dead and kept coming. Machine guns joined in, their barrels glowing red. Mortars thumped in the rear, sending shells arcing into the mass of attackers. Still, the Japanese pressed forward. They broke through in places, and hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Marines swung rifles like clubs. Soldiers drove bayonets into screaming enemies. Grenades detonated at close range, shaking the ground and filling the air with smoke and dirt. Bar teams shifted constantly. One gunner fired until his magazine emptied, then ducked down to reload while his assistant handed him a fresh one. Another team moved to a threatened flank, firing short bursts to keep the enemy pinned. Their firepower was critical. Without the bar, gaps in the line would have widened, and the Japanese could have overrun the position. The charge lasted for hours. The Japanese came in wave after wave, determined to fight to the death. Many were unarmed by the time they reached the American lines, grabbing at helmets, trying to wrestle rifles from defenders. The Americans fought in a grim, methodical way, driven by survival. Casualties mounted on both sides. As the sun rose higher, the scale of the slaughter became clear. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay in front of the American positions. Blood pooled in shell craters. Weapons and broken banners littered the ground. The cries of the wounded mixed with the stench of cordite and smoke. Some Japanese soldiers who were too badly wounded to continue pulled grenades from their belts and blew themselves up rather than surrender. American soldiers moved through the aftermath in shock. Many had never seen anything like it. They were hardened by weeks of fighting, but the sheer number of attackers and the ferocity of the assault left them shaken. Some spoke in hushed voices about the bravery of the enemy. Others were grimly silent, checking their weapons and preparing for another attack that, thankfully, never came. The failed Banzai charge marked the end of organized Japanese resistance on Saipan. Those who survived fled into the hills or committed suicide to avoid capture. The Americans held their ground, their defense anchored by the firepower of weapons like the bar. In the end, the Browning automatic rifle had proven its worth. It had stopped a mass attack that rifles alone could not have handled. It gave small groups of men the power to hold against overwhelming numbers. For the Japanese, the charge was both a last act of defiance and a devastating loss. Entire units were wiped out in a single morning. Officers who had sworn to fight to the last man kept their word. The American defenders, though victorious, understood that this battle was a sign of what lay ahead. The Pacific War was far from over. If Saipan's Banzai charge showed anything, it was that the enemy would never surrender easily. As the smoke cleared, the Marines and soldiers stood among the wreckage of the battlefield. They cleaned their rifles and swapped empty magazines for full ones. They buried their dead and treated the wounded. The bar gunners, their shoulders bruised and ears ringing, checked their weapons carefully. They knew the fight would move to other islands, other beaches, and other desperate battles. The lessons of Saipan would stay with them, carved into memory by fire and blood. The Browning automatic rifle, known to every U.S. infantryman simply as the bar, was a weapon born out of necessity. It first appeared near the end of World War I when armies struggled to find a gun that could move with advancing troops. Machine guns of the time were heavy and slow to set up. Rifles were accurate but lacked the volume of fire needed to stop enemy charges. The bar filled that gap. It could be carried by one man, fired on the move, and provide a steady stream of bullets to break an assault or cover a push forward. By the time the Second World War began, the weapon had been improved and made ready for the new kind of fighting that swept across Europe and the Pacific. The standard bar of World War II fired the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same round used in the M1 Garand rifle and the Springfield bolt-action rifle. This meant ammunition was easy to supply and had the stopping power to punch through enemy cover. The gun used a 20-round magazine that could be swapped out quickly. At full automatic, a trained gunner could fire between 500 and 650 rounds per minute, though in practice he used short bursts to avoid overheating the barrel. The weapon could also be fired one shot at a time when precision was needed. This selective fire gave the bar a flexibility few other weapons matched. The design of the gun was straightforward. It had a wooden stock and handguard, a sturdy steel receiver, and a long barrel that delivered good accuracy at distance. Its weight, just under 20 pounds when loaded, made it heavy compared to a standard rifle but light enough for a single soldier to carry into battle. The bipod attached near the muzzle could be folded down when firing from a prone position or folded back when moving. A sling let the gunner carry it across his back while climbing, running, or shifting positions under fire. In the Pacific, where dense jungle and broken terrain made large machine guns hard to use, the bar became a key weapon. The U.S. Army and Marines organized their squads so that each had at least one bar team. This team usually consisted of the gunner and an assistant who carried extra magazines and watched for threats. In practice, other soldiers often pitched in, passing ammunition or covering the gunner while he reloaded. The bar served as the backbone of a squad's firepower. In an attack, it laid down covering fire while riflemen advanced. In defense, it anchored the line and stopped enemy breakthroughs. The weapon was especially effective against the Japanese tactic of the Banzai charge. These charges were sudden, violent rushes where large numbers of men stormed U.S. positions, hoping to overwhelm them through shock and speed. Standard rifles, even the fast-firing M1 Garand, could not put out enough bullets to break up such attacks quickly. A machine gun could, but machine guns like the M1919 required a team, a tripod, and setup time. If the enemy attacked from an unexpected direction or broke through to the rear, moving a machine gun fast enough was difficult. The bar solved this problem. It could be carried into position almost as easily as a rifle. A bar gunner could drop to the ground, flip down the bipod, and open fire within seconds. If he needed to shift left or right, he simply picked up the gun and moved. This mobility allowed U.S. units to react to sudden threats and seal off gaps in the line before they widened. During a Banzai charge, bars were often the first weapons to respond, buying precious moments for heavier guns to get into action. The power of the .30-06 round made every burst deadly. Against lightly armed attackers rushing across open ground, the effect was devastating. The rounds tore through multiple targets, knocking men down even at long range. In the confusion of a charge, suppressive fire was vital. Even if every shot did not hit, The steady stream of bullets forced the enemy to slow, scatter, or take cover, breaking the momentum of the attack. This gave U.S. riflemen time to pick their shots and machine gun crews time to set up. The bar's quick reload was another advantage. A skilled gunner could swap magazines in seconds, keeping up almost continuous fire with help from his assistant. Reliability was another factor. The Pacific climate was brutal on weapons. Sand, mud, and humidity caused jams and rust. The bar's simple, rugged design held up well under these conditions. Soldiers learned to clean it carefully whenever they could, but even when maintenance was difficult, the gun usually kept firing. That dependability earned it respect among those who relied on it in battle. During night attacks, when visibility was low and chaos reigned, the bar provided a sense of control. Its rapid, distinct rhythm told friendly troops where the line was holding. In many fights, the sound of bar fire cutting through the dark was enough to reassure men who could not see more than a few feet ahead. In the din of combat, it was as much a signal as a weapon. The weight that made the bar steady also took a toll on those who carried it. Bar gunners marched long distances with the heavy weapon, extra magazines, and sometimes the bipod removed to save ounces. Their shoulders bore bruises from the recoil after hours of firing. Despite the physical burden, many gunners preferred the bar because of its effectiveness. They knew it could mean the difference between a defense holding or breaking apart under pressure. On Saipan and other islands, bar teams learned to use terrain to their advantage. They set up behind logs, coral ridges, and sandbags, firing in short bursts to conserve ammunition. When the enemy shifted, they shifted too, always trying to stay one step ahead of the attack. The gun's portability allowed them to cover multiple sectors in a single fight. In battles where every man counted, that flexibility was critical. The bar was not perfect. Its 20-round magazine emptied quickly during full automatic fire, forcing frequent reloads. Its weight, while manageable, slowed movement compared to a rifleman carrying only an M1 Garand. Yet these drawbacks were outweighed by its strengths. It was the weapon that linked the squad together, giving them the sustained fire needed to repel massed assaults. Against a Banzai charge, where speed and ferocity were the enemy's main weapons, the bar gave American forces the edge they needed to survive. The night before the attack, the battlefield lay quiet under a pale moon. The Marines and Army soldiers dug in along their positions, weary from weeks of fighting. Saipan had been a nightmare of dense jungle, rocky cliffs, and relentless assaults. The Americans knew the Japanese would not surrender easily, but no one expected what was about to happen. In the darkness, scattered gunfire echoed in the distance, then fell silent. Men on watch scanned the terrain, gripping their rifles tightly, unsure of what lay ahead. Before dawn, a strange calm settled over the island. The air felt heavy, and even the birds were silent. Then, without warning, the quiet shattered. A deep roar rose from the Japanese lines, a single cry swelling into thousands of voices shouting, "Tenno Haika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" The sound was primal, rolling across the battlefield like a wave. Out of the early morning haze, shapes emerged. At first, they seemed like shadows. Then the Americans saw them clearly, a mass of men rushing forward in a wide line. They came from every direction, some running, others limping, many already wounded. Behind them, officers drove them on, waving swords and flags. The defenders froze for a moment, stunned by the sight. The charge stretched as far as the eye could see. Some Marines thought they were hallucinating. Then the first shots rang out. Officers shouted orders, and the defensive line came alive. Riflemen rose from their foxholes and began firing. Bar gunners dropped to their knees, flipped down their bipods, and squeezed their triggers. The Browning automatic rifles barked, sending streams of .30-06 rounds into the rushing crowd. The first ranks of the attackers fell almost instantly, cut down before they reached the American lines. The charge did not stop. Those behind stepped over the dead and kept coming. Their rifles flashed as they fired blindly. Many carried bayonets, swords, or makeshift spears. Some held grenades, ready to throw them as they closed in. The Marines and soldiers poured round after round into the mob, but still they surged forward. The noise was deafening: shouts, screams, and the constant hammering of gunfire. Bar teams were critical in these first chaotic minutes. Positioned at key points along the line, they unleashed controlled bursts, each shot precise and deadly. The bar's mobility allowed gunners to shift quickly. When one flank began to buckle, a bar team moved in to stabilize it, laying down suppressive fire while riflemen regrouped. The M1 Garens cracked steadily, each shot a single note in the larger storm. Behind them, M1919 machine guns roared, their barrels glowing red as they spat continuous streams of bullets. Mortar teams in the rear added to the destruction, their shells whistling overhead before exploding among the attackers. The Japanese pressed on, heedless of losses. Entire squads were wiped out in seconds, yet more men appeared to take their place. At one point, a group broke through a weak section of the line, screaming and swinging bayonets. A bar gunner turned and fired point blank, cutting them down before they could reach the command post. His assistant slapped another magazine into the weapon, and they shifted positions again, sealing the breach before it widened. The defenders fought with grim efficiency. Each man focused on his task, firing, reloading, watching for flanking movements. Communication was shouted over the din, short and sharp. Left side, incoming, reloading, cover that gap. The bar teams worked like extensions of the larger unit, their rapid fire filling the spaces where rifles alone could not keep up. As one gunner went dry, another opened up, creating a continuous wall of bullets that shredded the attack. The battle raged on as the sun rose higher. Smoke hung in the air, mixing with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Bodies piled up in front of the American positions, creating grisly barriers. Still, small groups of Japanese soldiers crawled forward, trying to reach the lines. Some threw grenades, others leapt up in desperate charges. Many were cut down before they got close. Those who reached the foxholes were met with bayonets, rifle butts, and knives. In these moments, the fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal and chaotic. As the morning wore on, the sheer volume of American fire began to take its toll. The Japanese formations faltered. Commanders fell and coordination broke down. Survivors huddled behind fallen comrades or scattered into small groups, trying to find cover. The bar teams continued to move, leapfrogging positions to keep pressure on the enemy. Their mobility allowed them to chase down pockets of resistance and prevent any chance of regrouping. Within an hour, the charge had spent itself. What had begun as a roaring tide was now a broken trickle of scattered men. Some survivors retreated into the hills, dragging the wounded with them. Others chose death over capture. In the final moments, a number of Japanese soldiers pulled grenades and held them close, ending their lives rather than surrender. The cries of Banzai faded, replaced by silence and the low moans of the dying. The defenders held their ground, stunned by what they had witnessed. Thousands of attackers lay dead across the field. The once open ground was now a wasteland of bodies, weapons, and shattered banners. Marines and soldiers moved cautiously through the wreckage, checking for survivors and clearing any remaining threats. The men were shaken, their faces grim and pale. They had seen many battles, but nothing like this. The bar teams, exhausted and filthy, checked their weapons and counted remaining magazines. Their shoulders ached from the weight of the gun and the constant recoil. They knew how close the line had come to breaking. Without their firepower, the Japanese might have broken through and overrun the position. The battle had been won not by luck, but by discipline, coordination, and the steady, relentless work of every man along that line. When the shooting finally stopped, silence fell over the battlefield like a heavy blanket. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic smell of blood. Marines and army soldiers emerged from their foxholes slowly, weapons still ready, scanning for movement. They had been trained to expect deception. Many of the men feared that a wounded enemy soldier might rise suddenly and strike with a hidden grenade or bayonet. For several tense minutes, no one spoke. Only the groans of the injured and the distant crackle of fires broke the quiet. The men were shaken by what they had seen. Many of them had faced combat before on other islands, but nothing prepared them for the sheer size of the Banzai charge. Some soldiers described it as a human wave, endless and unstoppable until it was cut down. Even hardened veterans stood in stunned silence, trying to process the scale of the destruction. They had been taught to expect fierce resistance from the Japanese, but the level of commitment and willingness to die left them unsettled. For the bar gunners, the memory was especially vivid. One Marine gunner later recalled how his shoulders burned from the recoil as he fired magazine after magazine. He remembered the moment when the first wave broke through the smoke, screaming and charging with bayonets raised. There was no time to think, only to act. His assistant shoved fresh magazines into his hands as fast as he could. "I didn't look at faces," the gunner said later. "I just aimed at the center of the mass and kept firing. If I'd thought about who they were, I might have frozen." Another soldier spoke of the chaos and noise. The sounds of battle blended together. The sharp cracks of M1 rifles, the deeper roar of the bar, the pounding rhythm of machine guns. Over it all rose the cries of Banzai. The noise was so overwhelming that men could barely hear commands. Communication broke down, replaced by instinct and training. Units acted on hand signals, shouts, and the simple understanding that each man had to hold his ground or die. There were moments when the defense nearly collapsed. At several points, Japanese soldiers reached the American lines and leapt into foxholes. The fighting turned close and personal, with rifles used as clubs and knives drawn in desperation. A bar gunner described watching a fellow Marine wrestle an enemy soldier to the ground while another man fired over their heads. These moments of raw survival left lasting scars on those who lived through them. Even after the line stabilized, some men kept their weapons clutched tight, unable to relax. Among the Japanese attackers, many had been wounded before the charge even began. Some limped forward with bandaged limbs, refusing to stay behind. Others had no firearms left and carried only bayonets, swords, or wooden clubs. A few clutched sticks or sharpened bamboo poles. The charge was not just a military tactic, it was a cultural expression of Bushido, the warrior code that placed honor above life. To surrender was seen as the ultimate shame. For these men, death in battle was the only acceptable outcome. American soldiers later spoke with mixed feelings about this mindset. On one hand, they were horrified by the relentless attack and the suffering it caused. On the other, many felt a grim respect for the courage it took to face machine guns and bar fire without hesitation. The defenders understood that their enemy had been taught from childhood that surrender was dishonorable. This knowledge did not make the battle easier, but it gave context to the ferocity they had faced. In the aftermath, Marines and soldiers moved through the carnage with heavy hearts. They found not only soldiers among the dead, but also civilians who had been caught in the chaos. Women, children, and elderly men lay among the fallen, victims of the desperate final moments of the Japanese defense. Many civilians had been told false stories about American cruelty, leading them to flee or even take their own lives rather than be captured. The sight of these bodies shook the Americans deeply. Some Marines stood over the dead, silent and pale, struggling to understand the cost of the war they were fighting. Prisoners were rare. Those who were captured often appeared dazed or wounded beyond speech. American medics treated the injured, both friend and foe, setting up aid stations among the rubble. Even hardened combat veterans felt the weight of this work. A medic recalled binding the wounds of a Japanese soldier who had tried to kill him minutes before. "He was just a kid," the medic said quietly, "not much older than my brother back home." As the sun climbed higher, the scale of the destruction became fully visible. The open ground in front of the American lines was covered with bodies, weapons, and torn banners. The survivors moved carefully among them, checking for signs of life and guarding against sudden attacks. The smell of smoke and death was overwhelming. Many men later said that this was the moment when they truly grasped what total war meant. Not just battles and victories, but entire communities swept away. For the bar gunners and their assistants, exhaustion set in. Their hands were blackened with soot, their uniforms stiff with sweat and grime. They checked their weapons methodically, clearing jams and wiping down barrels. Some stared blankly into the distance, replaying the morning's events in their minds. Others sat quietly, heads bowed, saying nothing. The adrenaline that had carried them through the fight was gone, leaving only fatigue and an aching awareness of how close they had come to being overrun. The defense had held, but at a terrible cost. The men who stood along that line were forever changed. They had seen the enemy not as faceless soldiers, but as human beings driven by duty, fear, and belief. The Americans, too, felt the weight of their own survival, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and determination to see the war through to its bitter end. As the sun rose higher over Saipan, the battlefield lay silent. Smoke drifted from burned-out buildings and shattered trees. The ground in front of the American lines was covered with the bodies of Japanese soldiers, their banners torn and trampled. In a single morning, the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War had been launched and destroyed. The Japanese had thrown everything they had into that attack, even the wounded and those without weapons. Now they had nothing left to give. For the Americans, the scale of the victory was difficult to grasp at first. Entire Japanese units had been wiped out in less than an hour. Thousands were dead, their formations broken beyond repair. Marines and army soldiers moved carefully through the area, checking for survivors, collecting weapons, and searching for signs of organized resistance. They found little. There were a few scattered snipers and isolated soldiers hiding in caves, but the main Japanese force was gone. The attack had marked the final gasp of a garrison that once numbered more than 30,000 men. The destruction of the charge meant that the battle for Saipan was effectively over. There would still be skirmishes and clearing operations would take days, but the enemy no longer had the strength to launch coordinated attacks. American commanders could finally turn their attention to securing the island's airfields and ports. The capture of these facilities was the true objective of the campaign. From Saipan, US B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands for the first time. This would allow sustained strategic bombing of factories, ports, and military targets deep inside Japan's territory. It was a decisive shift in the war, opening a direct path to strike at the heart of the Japanese Empire. The cost had been high. The Americans had suffered heavy casualties during the initial landings and the weeks of fierce fighting that followed. The final Banzai charge added to that toll, with hundreds of men killed or wounded in a single morning. Even in victory, the atmosphere among the defenders was somber. They had seen the enemy fight with unimaginable determination, and they understood what that meant for battles yet to come. For the Japanese, the consequences were catastrophic. Saipan was not just a military outpost. It was a key defensive position protecting the inner circle of islands closer to the home territory. Its loss opened the way for American forces to move deeper into the Pacific. The defeat also shattered morale in Tokyo. News of the battle reached Japan quickly. When the emperor himself learned of the loss, it shook the highest levels of government and military command. Prime Minister Tojo and his cabinet faced immediate criticism, and within days, Tojo would resign. The fall of Saipan signaled to the Japanese people that the war was turning against them in a way they could no longer deny. The Banzai charge itself became a symbol of both courage and futility. For generations, Japanese warriors had believed in the code of Bushido, that honor came through sacrifice, that surrender was shameful. The men who charged that morning were following that tradition to its ultimate end. Yet the battle revealed the limits of such tactics. Against modern weapons like the BAR, the M1 Garand, and the M1919 machine gun, mass charges were simply slaughter. American firepower tore through even the most determined attack. The charge demonstrated that bravery alone could not overcome industrialized warfare. This realization was not lost on American commanders. As they surveyed the battlefield, they understood that Japan's military would continue to fight with the same willingness to die. Saipan was proof that every future island invasion would face similar resistance. It was also a warning. If the Japanese were willing to throw 4,000 men into a hopeless charge on a small island, what would they do when defending their home islands? This question weighed heavily on the planners back in Washington. Casualty estimates for future battles began to rise. Some officers predicted hundreds of thousands of American dead if the war continued with conventional invasions of places like Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and eventually Japan itself. Saipan's final battle gave those numbers a grim reality. The sight of so many bodies in one place, the knowledge that the enemy would never surrender, forced a reevaluation of strategy. In the months that followed, the American military adjusted its tactics. More firepower would be concentrated before landings. Naval bombardments would grow heavier. Close air support would become constant. And in the background, a different plan began to take shape, one that would avoid a direct invasion altogether. The lessons of Saipan, and of its devastating Banzai charge, influenced the decision to develop and ultimately use atomic weapons. If the Japanese could be forced to surrender without a mainland invasion, countless lives might be saved, both American and Japanese. For now, on Saipan, the immediate task was to secure what had been won. Engineers worked quickly to repair airfields damaged by shelling. Supply ships unloaded food, ammunition, and fuel for the next stage of the campaign. The dead were buried, friend and foe alike, under the relentless tropical sun. Patrols scoured caves and ravines, rooting out the last holdouts. Each day, small groups of Japanese soldiers were captured or killed, but no further organized resistance appeared. The battle was over, but the war pressed on. Saipan's capture marked a turning point. It gave the United States a forward base of unprecedented value. From its runways, B-29 bombers would soon take off, flying long missions to Japan itself. For the first time, cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka were within reach of sustained air raids. This was the strategic prize that had cost so much to win. The final, desperate charge of July 7th had delayed that moment by only a few hours, at the cost of thousands of lives. On both sides, the memory of the charge lingered. For the Americans, it was a reminder of the enemy's resolve and the price of each victory. For the Japanese, it was a story of sacrifice and loss, a moment when tradition collided with the modern reality of total war. Saipan's fields, once quiet and green, now bore the scars of a battle that had reshaped the course of the Pacific conflict. In the months after the battle for Saipan, the lessons learned from that island began to shape the way the U.S. military fought. Commanders reviewed the reports from every unit, examining what had worked and what had failed. One fact stood out above all others. The Browning automatic rifle had played a central role in holding the defensive lines and breaking the massive Banzai charge. The mobility and firepower it provided were not just useful, they were essential. Squads that had a bar team survived situations that would have destroyed those without one. In earlier years, many American infantry squads carried only rifles, with a machine gun positioned at the company or platoon level. The bar changed that structure. After Saipan, planners standardized the idea that each squad needed its own automatic weapon. This gave every group of 10 to 12 men the ability to put down a base of fire at a moment's notice. The bar was not as heavy as a tripod-mounted machine gun, but it could be carried by one man and brought into action quickly. It became clear that mobility was as important as firepower. A squad could shift position, attack, or defend without waiting for support to arrive. The experience of the Pacific confirmed what earlier battles had hinted at. Modern warfare required small units to be flexible and self-sufficient. The bar gave American infantry this edge. When U.S. forces moved on to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, every squad had at least one bar and often two. Training focused on how to integrate automatic fire with riflemen and grenadiers, creating a balanced team that could respond to any threat. This change in doctrine would shape the U.S. Army and Marine Corps for decades, influencing weapon design and squad tactics well into the Korean War and beyond. For the men who had fought at Saipan, the memory of that final charge never faded. Veterans carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke about it in interviews or memoirs, describing the terror and chaos of that morning. Others stayed silent, unable or unwilling to relive what they had seen. The sheer size of the attack and the total commitment of the Japanese soldiers made it unlike any other battle. It became part of Marine Corps lore, a story passed down to new generations as a lesson in endurance and resolve. The Banzai charge of Saipan was one of the largest in recorded history. Photographs and reports captured the scale of the event, but no image could fully convey what it was like to stand on that line as thousands of men rushed forward. Over time, documentaries and history books preserved the story. Museums displayed artifacts recovered from the battlefield: rifles, helmets, flags, and the battered remnants of a bar that had been fired until its barrel warped. These relics connected the public to a moment when two worlds collided on a small island in the Pacific. War memorials across the United States list the names of those who fell at Saipan. Ceremonies are held each year to honor their sacrifice. For Japanese families, the memory is just as powerful, though it carries a different weight. Many of the men who charged that day were never identified. Their families received no remains, only the knowledge that their loved ones had died far from home in a desperate act of defiance. Today, memorials in Japan bear their names, symbols of loyalty and loss. The charge also became a symbol of the clash between two military cultures. The Japanese fought under a code that valued death over surrender. Their belief in Bushido shaped every decision they made. The Americans, by contrast, focused on survival, firepower, and victory through technology and coordination. These opposing views of war met head-on at Saipan. The outcome showed that determination alone could not overcome modern weapons and tactics. Yet it also highlighted the human cost on both sides. Each body on that field represented a life shaped by beliefs, training, and the orders of distant leaders. As years passed, historians reflected on Saipan not only as a turning point in the war but also as a window into the nature of total war. It was a conflict fought by nations mobilized to their limits, with civilians and soldiers alike drawn into its path. The Banzai charge was dramatic and shocking, but it was also tragic. It showed how far people would go when convinced there was no alternative to death or victory. The bar itself became more than just a weapon. It was remembered as a symbol of American infantry power during World War II. Surviving examples were placed in museums, carefully preserved to show future generations what soldiers carried into battle. Veterans who had relied on the bar spoke of its reliability and effectiveness. Some even kept decommissioned rifles as personal reminders of the war. Over time, the bar's design influenced later automatic rifles and squad weapons. Though eventually replaced by newer models, its legacy lived on in the way modern armies equipped their soldiers. On Saipan today, the land has healed in many places. The beaches are quiet, the forests have grown back, and the scars of battle are hidden beneath the greenery. Yet signs of the past remain. Visitors still find rusted shell casings and fragments of weapons buried in the soil. Plaques mark the sites where critical events occurred, including the location of the final Banzai charge. Tourists walk the same ground where Marines and Japanese soldiers once clashed, trying to imagine the chaos of that day. For both nations, the memory of Saipan serves as a lesson. It is a reminder of what happens when war reaches its most intense and destructive form. The story of the bar teams holding the line against overwhelming numbers continues to be told because it represents not only a moment of tactical success, but also the resilience of the human spirit under unimaginable pressure. The Japanese charge, though doomed, is remembered for the courage of those who took part in it. These opposing narratives exist side by side, a reflection of how history is shared and remembered by former enemies. In military academies, the battle is still studied. Instructors point to the coordination between riflemen, bar gunners, and machine gun crews as an example of effective defensive tactics. They also discuss the cultural factors that drove the Japanese to launch such an attack. By understanding both sides of the battle, new generations of officers gain insight into the complexity of war. The lessons of Saipan remain relevant because they speak to fundamental truths about conflict, leadership, and the price of victory. The legacy of that day lives on through stories, artifacts, and the quiet reverence of those who visit the island. Though the bar has long since been retired, its role at Saipan endures as part of a larger history, a moment when technology, strategy, and human will collided in a struggle that shaped the course of a world at war.